Well, greetings everyone. This is a very exciting moment because now we're actually going to be rolling with the life and the meaning of Gandhi's life. So we have led up to this. We've talked about the big framework of the news story. We talked about what kind of thing nonviolence is. We talked about where it was to be found in the West and briefly touched on the Vedantic background of Gandhi himself, and now we get to talk about the man. I put a number of resources in the Google Doc, including one of the events that we'll have at the Petaluma Peace Harvest is a screening of the film Gandhi. That's a really useful resource if you know what to look for and what you're not going to see. So I put a paragraph of description of that, which incidentally has international input because I attended a meeting at a nonviolence institution in Berlin and we talked about this film and agreed about this. So if you read that paragraph and you have a chance to see the Gandhi film, it does give you a feeling of his impact and a sense of the scope and the two parts of his career in South Africa and in India. So I don't think it's possible for me to go through the history in 2.5+ hours because Gandhi was one of the most active human beings on the planet. He worked 15 hours a day. He would sleep sometimes less than 2 hours a night, sometimes a little more. And he kept 2 secretaries exhausted when he was in the UK. He had this titanic, unflagging energy. And he worked that pace for close to 40 years, maybe even a little more, count if you look at some of the South Africa years. So I'll be touching on some of the big historical episodes, but I really want to get at the question, who was this man? What did he discover and what was his impact on history? I don't know exactly where to begin. I'm sort of inventing this thing as we go along. But I think I'll start with what they call nowadays full disclosure. Various people have various attitudes about who they think Gandhi was. And I'm up there with one Indian who was quoted, while he was still alive, said, God sends a Mahatma Gandhi every 1,000 years. What he meant was that he considered Gandhi to be an avatar. Now, I don't have any litmus test for discovering whether a person is a bona fide avatar or just an illumined being, but there is no question that he achieved God consciousness. He did that in South Africa. The South Africa phase of his life kind of falls into 2 halves itself, because in 1902 he will go back to India thinking that he's taken care of stuff in South Africa. He can go back to Bombay, as it was then called, and set up a law practice. And he wasn't there for more than a month or 2 before he got a frantic telegram saying, everything that you built here has collapsed, you've got to come back, it's even worse. So that period from 1909 to 1915, when he really carries on the satyagraha intensely. Actually, I'm sorry, it's more like 1902 to 1915. We think that that was the period when he really carried on his most intense spiritual disciplines. It's hard to tell because although he was completely open and completely honest about everything, he was careful not to put himself on a spiritual pedestal because he knew that what would happen in India was that people in the millions would come and listen to him, but they wouldn't follow him. And he would rather have 100,000 who would follow him than, 1 million who would worship him as an avatar. So I hope you will indulge our 2 canine friends. They are keenly interested in this subject and cannot found a good way of keeping them out. So although he was completely open about almost everything in his life, he had to keep this part under wraps. He said, these are things that are known only to me and my God. So the ironic thing is, we know more about his bathroom habits and when he got diarrhea and things like that than we know about when he realized God. Because I believe that the reason is that they would put him in that funny category for Indians. He knew that Indians had now worked out this very capable mechanism of venerating sages but not following them. And he couldn't afford to have that happen. Now, there is no question what kind of realization he had. In India, these things were systematized pretty well. And I don't know if you're familiar with this system, but there were classically 3 paths. Oops. Three yogas, or 3 paths to self-realization, which are jnana, which is the path of discriminating wisdom, and bhakti, which is devotion, and karma, which is action. Now, this is, not just ordinary wisdom, but the kind of discriminating wisdom which enables you to see reality in the midst of unreality. And bhakti comes from a root bhaj, meaning to share. So it's actually participating in the being of the form of the supreme reality that you've chosen. And karma, I'm going to say more about that in a little bit. But in the Bhagavad Gita, which is the key text for the integration of all of these 3, you will see that none of these are not presented as compartments isolated from one another. These are emphases. So you will find plenty of bhakti or devotion in Gandhi, and you'll find incredible wisdom that he applied in the political and the social realm. But as for bhakti, there was a film in which some of the people who had worked with Gandhi were interviewed, and they were asked what was it like to be with him. And I remember there was a young lady, I forget who it was now, I probably would know her name by now, but she said that she was 9 years old when she was with Gandhi in his ashram. And she was asked, what was it like to be, what was your dominant impression of the Mahatma? And she said, his great love. And she said, it was like he was blessing you with his eyes all the time. Every time that he looked at you, you felt blessed. And as far as jnana or wisdom is concerned, we'll have a lot to say about his penetrating insights into what makes for successful action. Given what I've just told you about what he did for 15 hours a day for close to 50 years, there's no question that he was a man of action. And that's why for him, the Bhagavad Gita was the principal text. He memorized large parts of it. And he said that this was basically his spiritual reference book, because the Gita is a poem of action. And the Gita embodies, and we had a retreat on this topic at Mount Madana, the Gita embodies a theory of human action. At one point, the Gita says there are 3 things that you need to know. You need to know who is God, who are you, and what is the nature of action. There's no question to anyone observing him, any Hindu who is aware of this system, that Gandhi was a karma yogi. And that meant that the main emphasis for him was selfless action. And as I was about to say, there was a kind of formula that you can derive from the verses of the Gita to describe what selfless action is. Things get, much more nuanced, but just roughly speaking, there are three parts to it. You pick the correct act, you perform it with the correct means, which is, needless to say, the means of nonviolence, and then the difficult part is you have to renounce the results. There's a special term in the Gita, phala, which means fruit, and you have to be able to renounce the fruits of your action. The fruits means whatever benefit might accrue to you. And that could be, well, if you remember Socrates, I'm sure we all remember Socrates, he describes the corruption of every profession is where the professional gets interested in what am I going to get out of this. So if the physician is in it to cure patients, that's uncorrupted. When he says, my neighbor, who is also a physician, has a Ferrari, I'm going to at least get a BMW out of this, then that is a corruption of that profession. And on the spiritual level, it's a corruption of one's work. You're probably familiar with the term karma in a spiritual context where it means the spiritual residue of an action. So if you perform an action motivated by harm, that motivation, that harm, it becomes a kind of residue in your psyche. And you accumulate bad karma, and it's very difficult to act without accumulating bad karma. So in the Gita, the question that's posed by Arjuna is actually, how can I avoid action altogether? And Krishna says, you cannot. As long as we live on this planet, we're undertaking action even to keep our bodies alive. So the only hope for us is to learn to act in the correct spirit, so that the positive karma that we accumulate outdoes the negative karma. And incidentally, Gandhi said, it's not possible, as long as you are in a human body, it's not possible to avoid all violence. The goal of your life should be to minimize the harm that you do and maximize the good that you do, the nonviolence that you do. And that's all we can be, that can be expected of us, all that we can expect of ourselves. So about this point, the third tricky point about renouncing the fruits of action, Gandhi exemplified that when he was assassinated in 1948. He had material possessions that were worth approximately $5 by today's standards. He had 2 pairs of glasses, one of which was broken, a pair of sandals, and about 5 books, and an extra wearing cloth, and that was about all that he owned. At one point, someone came to him and said, "Am I really going to have to renounce all my possessions?" And Gandhi said no. And the man was absolutely thrilled. He said, you're the leader for me. I'm going to follow you. Don't have to renounce my stuff. But then Gandhi finished the sentence. He said, you don't have to renounce your possessions. You have to renounce the possessor. In other words, that sense of private self, which is usually looked upon as having 2 dimensions in the Vedantic tradition, I-ness and my-ness. The I and its possessions. So the minute you think I own something, you have created a separate I, because I own this thing, Luz Wire doesn't own it. That's how the separation and the egotism comes in. So we're going to say more about how this plays out in the economic field next week when we have our talk on constructive program.
Can you repeat what you said about being impossible to be purely nonviolent?
Yeah.
Expand on it.
I suppose what Gandhi meant was no matter how careful you are, life embodied in a physical form is going to involve some harm. Now, when I go to take a shower at night, there are these, at this season of the year, there are these tiny black jumping creatures in my bathtub, and they're not fleas, but I don't know what they are, but I try to save them, and I can't, because, I try and put a piece of paper under them, ping, they're a foot away somewhere. I go over here, pow, they're back here. I don't know what these critters are, but let's say I've got 7 of them in the tub, maybe I can get 4 of them out. But I say, look guys, I have to take my shower, No one's going to want to talk to me if I don't. So nonviolence will have a huge setback. So I'm not a Jain, so I don't wear a thing over my mouth to prevent me from inhaling microbes, and I don't brush off my seat before I sit down. So on some level, we're going to be causing harm. Now, that harm that we cause unintentionally is not going to harm us spiritually, but it also proves to be nearly impossible for a normal embodied human being to never wish harm to anyone. When I see the things that are going on in the world today, I lose patience quickly, and I start using, rather intemperate language about people. It's very hard. I have to haul myself back and say, look at their background, they don't know any better, and so on and so forth. But somewhere along the line, there is that feeling that they are destroying the planet, and is, out of sheer stupidity. So one has these thoughts, and those thoughts mean that one is going to accumulate some bad karma. So what's required of us is to make our best effort to minimize that negative karma and do as much good as we possibly can in the world to overcome it. Yes?
What about self-defense? What does Gandhi say about self-defense? Somebody's trying to kill you.
Yeah. What he said about self-defense was pretty much to leave it up to you. He said, if your nonviolence was perfect, you could probably live through your whole life without ever defending yourself physically. And nonviolence itself would defend you. We had this episode just 2 months ago in South Sudan where these 2 fellows refused to get out of the way when the militia wanted to kill these 13 people, women and children, and eventually the militia gave up and went away. And Derek Oakley said, if we had had weapons, we would be dead now. Now, but he did leave it up to you. He said, in the case of a woman whose honor is being assaulted, he said, if you have no other recourse, fight to the death. Better, even at the risk of your own life. Death better than dishonor was his way of looking at it. But it is interesting that in his, he lived to be a little bit older than I am now and was intensely active for half a century. And he never was in a situation where he had to defend himself or he had to use violence against another person who was attacking others. So those cases, if you're lucky, if you live right, they will never come up. So it's interesting to know that they're there on the theoretical level. But as to he left it up to you. Now, there was one occasion when at a prayer meeting, a serpent crawled over his leg, and it's hard for us to appreciate this because, I see snakes at home. They're gopher snakes, right? So I pick them up and I carry them out to the garden. But if you're in India, every other snake is deadly poisonous. It's a terrible way to die. They have a morbid fear of snakes from birth. It's very, very deep. I mean, somewhere in the limbic system in the brain recognizes that wriggly thing. It says death, destruction. So, but he was absolutely calm. He just sat there, let the thing crawl over his leg, crawl over his other leg, crawled away. Everybody else was in a state of extreme horror. I was going to start off by telling you 3 stories. I think I'll jump ahead a little bit and tell you one right now. Stephanie?
Oh, the story about when somebody came to Gandhi's house and said, he started to strangle him?
Yeah, actually, it's even better than that. He went to the guy's house.
Okay.
Gandhi was on tour, and he was told when he got to a certain area, above all, don't go to such and such a village because the village chieftain has vowed to kill you on sight. So he said, hot dog, or, hot chapati or something, let's go. We're going right away. And people said, no, you don't understand what we're telling you. I understand perfectly. I want to go and see this man. So he goes to the village. He goes to the man's house. He knocks on the door. The man opens. He's absolutely startled to see Gandhi, who says to him, I'm here to help you fulfill your vow. Because vows were very important. If you broke a vow, terrible things happened to you spiritually. Well, the guy actually reached out and started throttling him. And, Gandhi weighed about 105 pounds physically. He is not like Joe Louis. He was no match physically. The man actually for about a half a minute had his fingers on Gandhi's throat. And then he fell at his feet. And he said, I am at your service and my entire village is at your service. So this is an example of how, when your nonviolence is good enough, you do not need to defend yourself with force. So it becomes an individual question, is my nonviolence good enough to do that? Another story I was going to tell was late in his career, he took people from the ashram and they walked a good way to a rally. The issue was, this was one of those, what's called a princely state. It was just before independence, or just after independence, and this state still had a Maharaja. And so they wanted the Maharaja to institute certain democratic reforms. So they're having this rally, and in the middle of the rally, these gundas, these thugs, come in with clubs and they start beating people, crowning them on the head and breaking things up. Pandemonium breaks loose. The person telling this story is panic-stricken, and his first thing in his mind is, where's Gandhi? He looks across the crowd, he sees Gandhi, and it seems like Gandhi is trembling. So he's thinking, this is strange. I thought that this man had no fear. And he fought his way over to him. As soon as he got to his side, he discovered that Gandhi was not trembling in fear, he was trembling in revulsion. That the violence was just tearing him apart inside. And he was struggling. How am I going to stop this? And he hit on this thing, which I don't know about you, but I would not have thought of this in a million years. Well, maybe in a million years. He said, he ordered all of his people to leave and leave him there alone with the thugs. As soon as he was alone, he said to them, what's your problem? And they said, well, actually, we don't have a problem. We're hired thugs. We're just here beating people. So he said, well, it's all over now, so maybe you should just go back. And they said, all right, but they said it's a long ways to the ashram and it's a dangerous road, so I think you need an escort, and we're going to come along with you and protect you. So this is what you can do with this incredible power when you have carried it out to that level. Now, back on the wisdom piece for just a second, jnana, which comes from the same root as our English word know, but it means more than ordinary knowledge. It means the discriminating faculty that enables you to see reality even when it's covered over by all kinds of confusion. In the terrible days of the riots after partition, violence was breaking out all over. Wherever he went, he could make it stop. The Viceroy of India said, I have a choice. Whenever a city is engulfed in riots, I can send 50,000 heavily armed, highly trained troops, or I can send one little man who doesn't even have any teeth. And they both have the same effect, but by very different means. So he was referring to Gandhi as his one-man boundary force. But Gandhi could not be everywhere. So things were getting bad all over, and on one occasion he sent a young woman a Hindu woman, one of his nieces, grandnieces, to his village. And at that point, Mirabain, the British admiral's daughter who stayed with him for many years, she was shocked. She said, she's an 18-year-old girl. You can't send her to that village. You know, they're raping, they're killing. She'll be destroyed. And he motioned the girl to come over to him. And he simply looked at her right in the eye and he said, I don't believe in death. Do you? She said, no, Bapu. He said, then go. So off she goes. And sometime later, on his tour, Gandhi is able to visit this scene, see how she's doing. And she has gotten, the Muslims were massacring Hindus in this particular setting. She had gotten the Hindus whose homes had been destroyed into a kind of enclosure and was protecting them. And of course, because the entire village and all of its systems were destroyed, she was collecting food from one place or another and feeding these people. And she thought, Gandhi's going to be very happy with me for doing this. And when Gandhi showed up, he looked over the situation for a while and he said, no, you're making two mistakes. They cannot be separated. You're simply continuing what the violence was based upon, the sense of separateness. They have to be living side by side with their Muslim neighbors who had just been trying to kill them. So that was shock number one. Shock number two was that he said, you shouldn't be feeding them. She said, what? They've lost everything. He said, they've lost everything except their dignity. Now you're taking that away from them. He said, give them some work to do, whatever it is. Cleaning the latrines, whatever. Let them work and then give them food for that work. So this illustrates the incredible penetration that he had, the incredible optimism that he had about human nature, and the extreme importance of dignity in his own life and in the life of his opponents. I think one of Gandhi's secrets was that he knew how important self-respect was to human beings. And he could play upon that. He could give people back their self-respect, and then all of the other things that they were demanding was what in NVC we would call strategies, not needs. Self-respect after food, clothing, and shelter was absolutely basic need. This is why in South Africa, when he carried on his first and rather brilliant campaign, where Indians refused to fill out passes, they refused to take out a license, which is what criminals have to do. Asiatics, quote unquote, had to do the same thing. He refused, and he had people. If you've seen the Gandhi movie, you remember that scene where they're burning the passes. It came to a kind of crisis where he had to work out a compromise with Smuts, the Boer leader, and the compromise was, if you promise that you'll revoke this law, we will take out these passes voluntarily. Because the issue was not a piece of paper. The issue was your self-respect. And once they agreed that they would do it voluntarily, there was no loss of dignity in doing this. And after persuading the Indian community with great difficulty not to take out these passes, he had to go back and persuade them to take them out. We're having a kind of nonviolent canine satyagraha here. And this also shows another aspect while we're at it, that once he was able, and this again is a matter of jnana or wisdom, once he was able to see through to the core of any issue, he was able to make concessions on everything else. And that gave him a tremendous amount of wiggle room to operate politically with his opponents and with his followers. So on one occasion, in 1925, he had been in prison, and there was an issue of councils. The British were trying to win them over by letting Indian representatives sit in councils, but those councils were not to have any power. So this is not like what they just recently did with very generously and very handsomely with Scotland. They could sit in councils, but the council would have no power. And for the second or third time in his career, Gandhi said, no thanks. We're way past this point. We need real authority now. This is not going to, we're not going to accept this. Unfortunately, though, he was put in prison, and his followers were divided because this was the first time they'd been offered anything like that. There was a tendency to grab for the concession that's being offered to them. It was intoxicating almost. So there was a group, Chittaranjan Das and I think Nehru and a bunch of others, became in favor of what's called council entry. But then Gandhi was released, and so the cat has come back, the mice were playing, what's going to happen? He looked the scene over, and he said, those people, the council entry people who were against me, they love the country as much as I do. They arrived at their decision by correct means, and I am actually going to help them. I'm going to join their party, which he did. Now his inner followers were horrified that, you've given away everything that we've fought for. One of his women followers wrote and said, you've disgraced us, you've given away everything. And he sent her a message through a friend saying, tell sister not to worry, my surrender was my victory. And this was an incredible capacity he had to be able to give up stuff which we would cling to if we were thinking about it egocentrically, and not to feel any personal. He said, my self-respect comes from my awareness of God. It doesn't come from whether I get this or that concession from you. So having that sense of self-respect, he's able to see that it was more important that the revolution stay together than that it break up over this, particular issue. Sure enough, 1 month later they came around, which was often the case. They said, you were right. Now this illustrates something else, but go ahead, Lou, you had a question.
Well, I was just saying what you're saying now really reminds me that the reason that I see spirituality as being such a strong component of nonviolence is because it's the internal awareness of what you're saying, or the internal peace, or like having self-respect or being strong inside is what gives you the room to give up things. Say, well, I don't really need that. That thing that we're fighting over, I don't need it. I don't have a problem giving it up. Because I've got internal. I'm meeting my needs internally, or I'm aware of what's important to me internally. And that seems like a spiritual thing.
That is exactly a spiritual thing, and that is what gave him his power. And even one of his close followers, Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who was probably his closest to him spiritually, although Vinoba was in another way, his followers were once asked, he had 80,000 people following him. These were people who were wedded to violence by their whole culture. They laid down the gun, they let themselves be beaten, humiliated. And Mukulika Banerjee asks them afterwards, how could you do this? And they said, we were drawn to his spirituality. And that was Khan. So I think I lost my train of thought. That's okay, there's lots of trains of thought going on here.
Anyone else have any questions? Does anybody else you wanted to pause?
Yeah. Yes, I've said a lot already, so perhaps there are other questions you want to come in.
It might be minor points. I'm just curious, because you said that you see Gandhi as an avatar, but then you also you describe him as a karma yogi. Are these two different things? Or?
No. He achieved whatever he achieved, whether I'm right or not, and the others are right or not, that he actually achieved avatarhood, which I can describe it a little bit in a second. His main path was karma yoga. That's how he did it. But again, as I've said, this is not an airtight compartment. There was plenty of bhakti and plenty of wisdom. But his underlying commitment was selfless action. So he had mastered the art of doing the right thing and doing it with the right mechanism, the right means, and the right spirit, and then dropping the results. For example, when India achieved independence, he could have been the prime minister, he could have been the president, he could have been anything. But he decided this was not the Swaraj that I wanted, and he just went off by himself. So as far as being an avatar is concerned, I think the main thing that we look at is what was his impact. What was his impact on history? And there, I think we can look at that on different levels. The fact is that excuse me one second, he was able to accomplish, I would say, probably more than any single human being in history, in recent history. Because on one level, because what he did was, as we know, he decolonized India. And a lot of people forget even that. They say, oh, Gandhi failed. They forget that he decolonized India. He broke it free of the greatest empire the world had ever seen, which was extremely skillful as well as powerful. But there's a couple of things that they missed. And he was even more skillful than they. I'm going to interrupt myself for a second here because there's something that he said which it was really a kind of terrible observation, but I think what we're seeing now is that it was true. He was asked during World War II, are the Allies going to prevail? And he said they are going to prevail, but in order to do so, they will have to be more brutal than Hitler because they have chosen his means. And I think that's exactly what we are seeing today. Everything that we despised about Hitler, we're now doing it. And because we decided to fight him on his ground, we had to be stronger than he was at what he was doing. So anyway, but before I get quite back to my point, I do want to say something about Poland, because he made a comment about the Polish resistance. And he made a very interesting comment about that. He said, I'm going to call it almost nonviolent, because the Poles knew that they would be crushed to atoms. That's his exact language. And yet, rather than give up, they fought back with everything they had. So they weren't prepared for nonviolence, so it wasn't an option for them. But they chose violence over cowardice. And Gandhi was willing to call that almost nonviolence. And I think, now that you think of it, I never made this connection before, but I think that this actually led up to the success of the Solidarity movement. That they had, in a way, they had done the most nonviolent thing they could in that situation. And so that positioned them to take it a step further when they had their freedom. Yeah.
Are you taking comments?
Almost. Let me finish what I was saying about his impact on history, and then I'll take the comments. So, yes, he decolonized India, and that in itself was more than, what millions and millions of people are able to accomplish. But he said himself, I have used India. I have used India as an ocular demonstration of the power of nonviolence. And I would go a step further and say that his impact on history was the same as that of Jesus and Buddha. Because what they did was come into a civilization which had made a spiritual breakthrough, and that spiritual breakthrough was about to be overwhelmed by a secular power. In the case of Jesus, it was the Romans. In the case of Buddha, it's a little bit less clear, but obviously things had degenerated into ritualism and so forth, and the spiritual meaning of the tradition that was lost. And so Jesus, in a way, rescued this incredible idea of monotheism, of which the Romans were, trampling on. And it didn't do the Jews much good, unfortunately, but did the rest of the world a lot of good. Buddha put India back on the spiritual path, even though it then had to rediscover its original, let's call it Hindu format, but that's a different issue. But in India, you had this incredible spiritual civilization, and as I was leading up to saying this before, the British didn't get it. They did not understand the significance of self-respect, and they did not understand the power of spirituality for Indians, or for anyone else for that matter. So it was on that level that he was able actually to outsmart them. They did sort of understand that he was going to even get them. I mean, Gilbert Murray, the classic scholar, yay, hooray for Greek mythology. Gilbert Murray actually would warn people when they went over, don't go anywhere near Gandhi, he will get you. Yeah. So I think he has this tremendous impact on history, which we're only beginning to explore. And I think Gandhi was hundreds of years ahead of his time. But unfortunately, we don't have hundreds of years to catch up with him. So given the tremendous impact that he had on history, I think this is what you would call an avatar, meaning someone who was completely invested by divine power and designated to have, no egocentric disturbance whatsoever. I mean, I'm kind of talking through my hat here. Not only am I not an avatar, yes, this is a frank confession I'm making here, but as far as I know, I've never even met one. So here I'm just, this is hearsay. But in terms of him being a karma yogi and in terms of his achieving God consciousness and having done that probably in the second half of his South African career, I think we're on pretty secure ground. Okay. Comments before we go any further? Okay.
Gilbert who?
Gilbert Murray, he was a great classic scholar. He taught at Oxford. Well, we don't need to drag me back to my original career here. I think I've exhausted that karma. So it is interesting to observe that in the year 1893, two emissaries leave India for the West. One was Gandhi, who goes to South Africa, as you're probably aware, to take up a rather undistinguished kind of job, because he was basically a flop as a lawyer. And I think the reason that he was a flop was that, basically he was a timid person, and lawyers, that doesn't really work well in that profession. But also, there's a line that I think Edward says in Shakespeare's King Lear, I never yet was valiant where I was not honest. I don't think Gandhi felt good about fighting one person's cause against another person. And he didn't himself understand that. And he really only became comfortable with his law degree when he has this breakthrough in South Africa. He's working on this case, and he realizes the function of the law is to unite people who have been riven asunder. Once he saw it that way, he could use his legal training in his work. So Gandhi goes to South Africa and confronts racism for the first time, face to face. Eventually will go back to the belly of the beast and be ready to take on the empire itself. And Swami Vivekananda goes to Chicago for the Parliament of Religions and introduces the West to Vedantic civilization. And it is kind of interesting that both of those people do that in the same year. It's almost as if, the clock, they just reached the point where It's time for the West to get an infusion of spirituality. Gandhi almost met Vivekananda, by the way. He stopped by one time at the ashram, but Vivekananda wasn't there. So they came that close. So thinking of his characteristics now as when the mature Gandhi, when he functions, one thing you could say about him was really distinguishing. He always, if you asked him, what's different about you, and I'm rather proud of this fact, actually, he would always say, my large ears. He had very large ears. And I feel kind of good about that. But looking at him, one of the outstanding characteristics of his personality, which started even before he gets to be a God-conscious being, was his sincerity. He was absolutely sincere. If he believed something to be true, he would carry it out. If he found out it wasn't true, he would drop it instantly. And he was perfectly honest. And as Mahadev Desai said about him, when he went to the Round Table conference in London in 1931, he spoke for 2 hours without notes. And everyone, the journalists crowded around him afterwards and said, how could he do that? And Desai said, what Gandhi thinks, what he says, and what he does are the same. You and me, we think one thing, we say a second, and we do a third, so we have to keep notes or we don't know where we're at. So he had that kind of, to use the term literally, that kind of integrity, a perfect groundedness in what he believed to be true. Not only that, he wanted everybody else to develop that. So he actually said, if you believe something is true, even though I know you're wrong, I want you to act on it. Because by acting on it, you will find out whether it's true or not. Whereas if I push you out of shape and make you do what I think is right, you'll just be waiting for an opportunity to get back. So this became, in his nonviolence, this became what we call coercion versus persuasion. Wherever possible, you do not coerce people into doing things. You persuade them to do it of their own volition, and it's much more powerful.
Seems important with children in
Uh-huh.
that way, to see life as a kind of an experiment, because the same way if a parent is
Yeah.
handing you down a set of
Mm-hmm.
right and wrong that you
Mhm.
don't get to test and you don't question, later on you'll
That's right.
rebel.
Yeah. We have a Montessori teacher here on staff, and she's pointing out that this is particularly important with children. If you tell them this is right, this is wrong. Obviously, you have to give them some guidelines. When the classic example of a child is about to touch a hot radiator, you don't say, yes, that'd be an interesting experiment. You'll find out whether radiators are sometimes hot. No, you warn them. But as far as possible, you allow them to grow and discover things on their own. I wish I had known that when I was raising children. So he also had an incredible capacity for self-sacrifice. And there is a pattern that I have noticed, and a few other people have noticed, that a critical point in his life came in July of 1906, when an event known to history as the Zulu Rebellion took place. We were talking last time, Jill raised this point when I was talking about scapegoating, that everything hinges on who gets to write history. The Zulus never got to write the history of the Zulu Rebellion. It was the British who wrote it. So they called it a rebellion. Just as 12 years before Gandhi is born, you have the famous Sepoy Mutiny in India. Well, the Indian historians called it the first freedom struggle. So we have this going on, of course, today. Are you a terrorist or a freedom fighter? Anyway, he saw it firsthand that the Zulu Rebellion was not a rebellion. It was a punitive raid. that the Boer and British were carrying out because the Zulus refused to pay certain taxes, and they had killed a tax collector to make their point. It was exceedingly brutal, and so he actually saw the total brutality of racism face to face for the first time. And he realized he had already decided back in 1893 that he was going to fight this thing. You know the story. He was thrown off the train in Pietermaritzburg because he was brown. And on that occasion, he decided, and you see this, he was pretty well portrayed by Attenborough in the film. He says, well, I say it has to be fought. I think the remarkable thing is that though he was exceedingly sensitive to the assault on his dignity, more sensitive, I think, than you and I would be. He was stung to the core, but in some strange way, he didn't take it personally. He said, this is the evil of racism, and on a deeper level, this is man's inhumanity to man, and I have got to fight it as such. So he had the opportunity. He was a lawyer, and he had the opportunity to sue the railroad company because the Transvaal was a colony under British administration. At that point, racism was technically illegal. He could have sued them, but he said, okay, that'll take care of my problem, but that won't take care of the problem. So when he sees what's being done to the Zulus, he sees the full depth of violence that was being perpetrated by Western civilization. Starts to shake his faith in that civilization as a world order, but he also sees, I'm going to need more power to overcome this thing. Now, in India, even in kind of folk awareness in India, there is a dynamic which is very unfamiliar to us, which I think I've mentioned before, which is when you want power, you get it by renouncing something. So even in these epics, which are turned into DVDs, and you buy them in Indian import stores on University Avenue, which are not very high art. They're basically like cowboy movies. Even there, they embody these stories where the hero surrenders something in order to gain power. So knowing that he was going to need tremendous amount of power, he takes these two vows, each one more horrendous than the next. The first is, I will never own anything from now on. And again, we're going to get back to this when we talk about Gandhian economics next week. But the next was the vow of complete self-control, among other things, in the sexual area. That is brahmacharya, or complete continence. And it cannot be a coincidence that just a mere month or so later, he finds himself in the Empire Theater in Johannesburg, and he suddenly finds himself with an opportunity, unexpected opportunity, to galvanize the Indian community and launch a satyagraha. And again, this was very well portrayed in Attenborough's film, though I don't think that language actually occurred, but what he said there was true to character. So no sooner does he make this renunciation than he gets this incredible opportunity to launch satyagraha. I think that's a dynamic which we shouldn't miss. So I've pointed out that he didn't take things personally, and he saw past the personal affront, but at the same time, sometimes I think this might be his greatest contribution to what we need now. He saw the significance of the human individual. So he places a lot of emphasis on what he calls swadeshi, or localism, personal power. So you should never violate what you feel to be right, even though he knows that it's wrong. etc. And there's a delightful film called Gandhi's India, which is very hard to come by, about his economic policy. And in that film, there's a woman named Asha Devi. Her full name is Asha Devi Aranyanayakam, who was a teacher in the Naitalam system that he set up. And the interviewer apparently has asked her, don't you think that Gandhi was naive, that he didn't take into account the limits of human nature? And she says, there are no limits to human nature. And it was, I think that may, as I say, be his chief discovery, because as Martin Luther King said, we have to make a shift from a thing-oriented civilization to a person-oriented civilization. We're going to have to discover, as you were saying a little while ago, Lou, that the resources are in us that we need, and that actually, when completely cultivated, those resources are not limited. Yeah.
Question from the webcam.
Yeah.
People. How do you develop this that same kind of singleness of purpose of Gandhi, like thought, word, and deed?
Well,
Being alone.
that is the 64,000 rupee question. How do we get to be like that? I know for me, the life-changing discovery of my life was this kind of double discovery that Gandhi was much, much greater than I had thought, and that he was also much more accessible. And I think that the way we do it is by the kinds of practices that he carried out that may be a little bit different for various of us, but it has got to involve self-control, which has got to mean that we eventually, as he said, you can have such control over your mind that even in your sleep you will not have a violent dream. So meditation is designed for that purpose, to give us control over our thoughts so that we're no longer at the mercy of random thinking. And that tends to preserve a tremendous amount of power. So I'd say that's the core.
And then can you talk a little bit more about the scientific process and how the method and what it has to do with Gandhi's thought? So like testing a hypothesis.
Oh, yes, okay. You know, I had 3 quotes that I am going to put or have put on the Google Doc, and this is a good opportunity for me to read one of them to you. Another thing that makes Gandhi incredibly helpful for us is that his approach was absolutely free of dogma. It was entirely scientific. Everything that he thought was true, he tested out in the laboratory of human experience. If it turned out not to be true, he would abandon it like that. It was reminiscent of Einstein. Einstein was once asked, how did you make this incredible breakthrough, which is in a way greater than what any human being has been able to do in terms of breaking out of the box and discover that time and space are relative? And he said, I did it by questioning one accepted axiom. So we need enough of a box to continue with our process, but even the box is something that we have to hold lightly. Okay, so the year is 1932. He is in prison. The British have decided that there should be a separate electorate in India for the caste Hindus and the outcasts, or panchamas, the 5th category people. And Gandhi's whole life work is to reorient these people into society, to get untouchability out of Hindu life. And as he said, we are the panchamas of the empire. If we're practicing untouchability towards people in our community, they're going to have every right to practice untouchability towards us. So he felt that this had to stop, because who gets to vote defines who belongs to the polity, the political community. The British may not have appreciated that. But he felt what they're going to do is vivisect the country, and this has to stop. I must stop it, but he's in prison. So how? And when he's in prison, he went along with prison regulations. He was like Socrates again in that respect. When Socrates was condemned to die, his friends figured out a scheme by which they could rescue him. And he said, I'm not going anywhere, because if I do, these people will never realize what they've done with this decision. So, anyway, when he was in prison, he went along with prison rules, and the British could see what happened. They put him in prison, all hell broke loose. It's like what we were saying about Phineas the chimpanzee, take the peacemakers out of the community and you get chaos. Put them back in and you get order. So let them experience that. So he wasn't going to be political in there, but he also had to do something. He could not let this pass. And he went through a terrific struggle, and at the conclusion of this struggle, God said to him, go on a fast unto death. And he does, and it's one of the most dramatic stories in the greatest story ever told, that the communities come together, and he basically dealt racism a severe blow with this event. So,
how is he sure that it's the voice of God?
That was the question. So then, if I were to come out of my meditation hall one morning and say, I heard the voice of God, I'm supposed to have 2 cups of chai this morning, people would be perfectly justified in saying, oh yeah, you heard the voice of God, sure. So people did say, how do you know it wasn't a hallucination? Here's what I've been leading up to. Thank you for your patience. This is what he said. The claim that I have made is neither extraordinary nor exclusive. No, it's not exclusive to me. God will rule the lives of all those who will surrender themselves without reservation to him. Here is no question of hallucination. Now get this. I have stated a simple scientific fact that can be verified by anyone who will carry out the necessary preparations, which are, again, incredibly simple to understand and easy enough to practice where there is determination. Okay, so as we go into our break, let me just point out that I have verified this claim in the negative because I have not carried out the necessary preparations. I have not surrendered myself completely, and I don't hear the voice of God. I hear fancy here. Yes, Monica?
What are the preparations?
Well, they're complete renunciation of self-will. I started to tell you a story, and I have a feeling I may not have finished it. Yeah. Yeah, we will in a second. But this person said, oh, no, I did finish the story. The person said, do I have to renounce my possessions? And he said, no, you only have to renounce the possessor. So this sense that, no, I am Monica Nemko. I own this, I own that, I am different from you, which we're born with. Somehow that sense has to be overcome. You have to be aware that you are only a package of the same reality that's in everybody else. You have noticed by now that I have a tremendously positive view of Gandhi, and it's not like what you're going to hear from almost anybody else. A lot of the time, people have incredibly negative things to say about Gandhiji, and I've noticed that they somehow give themselves a license, that they can make up the most incredible things, and somehow in his case they feel like it doesn't matter whether you tell the truth or not. I've heard people say, what about those thousands and thousands of people who were killed in the freedom struggle, which never happened. And it gets worse from there. And just as I think I was saying last time, that the way to understand nonviolent dynamics is not to start off by looking at where it fails, because it will appear to fail in some cases. And until we've trained ourselves to get underneath the appearance and see the reality and be able to connect the dots like I was just trying to do with the Polish resistance and the solidarity movement, we'll be taken in by those failures. So given our own weakness, the best way to understand nonviolence is to look at where it succeeds and ask ourselves what happened. How did it succeed? What is the dynamic? And similarly with Gandhi's life, you see these kind of strange things that he did, but I would put them in the category of this episode in the Bible where in Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, there's a fig tree and he wants to feed his disciples and his friends, and the tree isn't bearing any fruit. He curses it. They pass by a few hours later and notice the tree is shriveled up and died. And people say, oh, he shouldn't have done that. That's nasty. Well, I think you have to sort of almost be an avatar in order to understand why they do everything that they do. But when you get to experience the basic impact of who he was and what he did, then that gives you an opportunity to branch out and look at the details as well if you want to.
What if someone rejects the idea of Gandhi's status as you're giving him, and then that helps to reject all of the ideas that you're talking about him? So can you talk a little bit about, as another way to come at Gandhi other than from the high spiritual status that you're giving him? You're kind of giving him like the highest spiritual status.
Yeah.
So is there another way of understanding him as a strategist, as a human being it almost makes him seem like non-human in a way?
Well, it either makes Gandhi seem non-human or it makes humans seem capable of much more than we realized. And I'm going with the latter path. If you can explain to me in some other way how a person sleeps for 2.5 hours every night, how he is absolutely without fear, and how he's given up all his possessions and yada yada, all the rest of it, without him having overcome his self-will and being united with some kind of underlying power, I hope, listen to you and entertain your explanation, but I don't see any other explanation. Picking on what?
Picking on your boy.
Yeah, come on, leave my boy alone. No, I think if there were some other explanation, I would be certainly willing to entertain it, but I don't see any other way. Where does all of that energy and that wisdom and that love and that self-denial come from? I don't know any other way that it can come about. Plus, he pretty much said as much if you read between the lines. He didn't say that, yes, maybe it was a hallucination, maybe I didn't hear the voice of God. He said, I heard the voice of God, and you can hear it also. Now, unlike a scientific proof, he has no way of proving to us something that he experienced at that depth. We would have to reproduce what got him there. Here's another little insight that might be helpful. He comes with a few friends to visit an ashram in a spiritual community. And at the end of the day, the disciples gather around their teacher, the head of the ashram, and say, well, what do you think? And he said, today we were visited by a real yogi. And they asked him, how did you know? And he said, the way he gave absolutely one-pointed attention to everything. I mean, just think of the way he picked up that pencil. You and I, we look like we have 4 or 5 different pairs of eyes, where with him it was absolutely one-pointed attention. So that's a skill that people can practice, and it's also a result of the practice of meditation, though he didn't like very much to use the word. He often called it prayer. Another thing I'd like to emphasize about his the way he was and what made it possible to do all of this, and incidentally, let me interrupt myself for a second, go back. When I was looking at his impact on history, I forgot something. So he not only brought about the decolonization of India, but something like 50 nations were decolonized in the wake of what he had accomplished. And Albert St. Georgi, the Nobel Prize-winning chemist, or biologist, I guess, actually he got 2 Nobel Prizes, one for each. He said at the beginning of the 20th century, force reigned supreme. Along came Gandhi proving that force was, I forget exactly what he says, but force was an illusory power, that one person could overcome an empire. Proving that force has lost its suggestive power. I think that's it, yeah. That he saw that threat can only work if you allow yourself to be frightened by that threat. And it's even been said, when it's argued that we had to develop the atomic bomb because Hitler might have done it first, people have actually said, let's suppose that he had 1 or 2 of those things and he destroyed a couple of cities, and we refused to yield. We refused to be frightened. Even that enormous power would have been absolutely useless. So, anyway, back to our picture, all of these countries are decolonizing, and actually you could say that he brought a whole era of history to an end, the era of what I would like to call colonization 1.0, the early version of colonization. We do it differently today. It's much more subtle. In some ways, it's more brutal in others. But he brought to an end an entire period of colonization where it seemed like if you had enough gunboats and you could sail into the harbor and terrorize people, you could take over their country. And that was considered completely legitimate until he stood up to it. And I think that in the long run, he actually will prove to have, as they say in Buddhism, given a big kick to the wheel of the law. And as we know, the law is, ahimsa is the highest law. He will have shown that in the long run that the era of violence is over. That it has only suggestive power. If we don't take the suggestion, we cannot be ruled by it. As he says in the movie, someone says, they may kill you. He says, then they will have my body, not my obedience. So another thing I wanted to emphasize was his incredible sense that the underlying reality was positive. And this is in complete contrast to American pop culture. I know it's kind of unfair to compare somebody of his stature with, Star Trek isn't even a particularly bad example, but I go around and I collect these descriptions of films, and they'll say like, truth is ugly, and real ain't pretty, and the beast at the center of the universe. Without realizing it, we have actually imbibed a model of reality where reality is negative. Reality is harmful. Without realizing how terrifically wrong that is and how terrifically harmful that is. So that's why he had those 3 little monkeys, was one of the few possessions that he owned. See no evil, because it's not really there. Hear no evil, speak no evil. And in describing what satyagraha is, the great invention that he made, I'm going to read you this quote, but it's also in the Google Doc, and you can look at it at your leisure. He says, the world rests upon the bedrock of satya, or truth. Asatya, meaning untruth, untruth also means non-existent. As satya or truth also means that which is. If untruth does not so much as exist, its victory is out of the question. And truth, being that which is, can never be destroyed. This is the doctrine of satyagraha in a nutshell. his firm belief was that evil has no independent existence. Evil exists only insofar as we support it. Withdraw your support, and it's no longer there. Now, some people have thought that this is all that there is to the discovery of nonviolence, when you think of nonviolence as only the resistance against an autocratic regime. If you withdraw your support from that regime, it has no power over you. But it's much deeper than that. He would also go on to say that the British did not take India, we gave her to India, to the British, and when we take her back, there will be no way that they can resist us. He also said, I put this quote up there too, I mentioned that one of the things that the Attenborough film does not show you is satyagraha actually converting someone. There were many, many such, like the one where he goes up to that village headman, or when he says to his people, go back and leave me alone, with the mob. On one occasion, he was threatened by these Black Flag people. They were going to beat him. And he just laughed and said, okay, so you break my head. What are you going to get from that? And they said, well, we have this problem. What should we do? He started instructing them how they should wage satyagraha against him, and leading up to go on fast unto death if I don't, comply. They said, we're not prepared to do that. And he said, well, then I can't help you. But his belief in satyagraha was that it was a method of surfacing truth in which both parties would gain. It was not against another party. So he didn't mind people offering satyagraha to him. So they would both help. And he says, what satyagraha does in these cases is not to suppress reason, but to free it from inertia and to establish its sovereignty over prejudice, hatred, and other baser passions. In other words, if one may paradoxically put it, it does not enslave, it compels reason to be free. I put that on the Google Doc because I think we need to really look at that and ponder it. What he's saying is that when you are attacking me, the deepest part of you does not want to attack me. And when I step out of that framework and reflect something back to you about that deeper part, you will actually be relieved to be able to stop your attack. And this is what makes satyagraha work, that people really want it to work. Now, I actually experienced this once, though once again, I'm not an avatar and all the rest of it. But I was walking off campus with another classics colleague of mine, not much physically bigger than myself, and there were these four guys standing in front of us on the sidewalk, and it was pretty clear from their body language that they were going to rob us, beat us up, whatever, what to do. I know turning around and running would not have worked because they would be faster. I was pretty good at 100 yards dash, but never mind. I did not think we would get away. So I said to my friend, just keep on walking. And when we passed them, we kind of walked through them. They said, hey, you got a match? My friend started fumbling for a match. I said, don't do it. Just keep walking. And we walked right through them, with me repeating my mantra like crazy, Rama, 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 get me out of here. And when we got down to the sidewalk on Oxford Street, we looked back, and the four of them were standing in the light. And again, you could interpret their body language, though we couldn't hear what they were saying. And they were relieved, strangely enough. They were tremendously relieved. Why? Because two classic scholars would have been given them a hard time. I don't think so. I think they were relieved because there was peer group pressure compelling them to attack us when their own inner nature did not want to do that. As St. Augustine says, the deepest desire in human nature is to realize our unity with others as far as that is possible for us. Okay.
There seems to be something about the dynamic of effective satyagraha from these interpersonal, at the interpersonal level specifically, because I think that that's what satyagraha is trying to do, is to make it a human-to-human interaction, interaction. But that, like when Gandhi went to that man's door at the village, he didn't wait for the person to come to him and then find him. And, you know, even if it was, if he was just ignoring them, he said, it wasn't cowardice to say he was just ignoring it, and said, you know, if this guy really needs it, he'll come find me. Because that could still be a kind of courage that, like, you don't have to go over to that guy's door.
Yeah.
So there just seems to be something about that, being able to confront and kind of throw somebody off in a way that it surprises them, that you not only are not afraid of them, but you're willing to confront them.
Yeah. I think for you and me, the best policy would be to get out of the district as fast as possible. But for him, the best policy was to go and confront the guy and offer himself to him, relying on what we call the power of vulnerability. And I think, I'm going to make a strange statement here, but I think he enjoyed it. I think he loved doing things like that, because he had done it so many times before that he knew that he could make it work, and that there was nothing more enjoyable in his life. But finding people who disagreed with him, maybe who hated him, and winning them over. Now, it doesn't mean it will always succeed. He worked very hard on Jinnah, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who brought about the separation of Hindus and Muslims, the end, the partition. He went to the most desperate lengths to win him over. But as they said, Jinnah had a problem for every solution Gandhi could come up with. And this is important to know about nonviolence. We call this work versus work. I think I mentioned it before, that you will not necessarily always see the result that you want from a given interaction. But the difference between violence and nonviolence is you can be absolutely confident that to the degree that your intention was nonviolent, it had a good effect. You can't always see where that effect is going to show up, but it will be there, and we can be absolutely confident about that. Now, in his case, I think he actually felt it. So he didn't have to put two and two together. He felt it happening. But for us, I think we have to, look at the long arc of history. We have to be able to look past some of the difficulties that India is going through now and realize that they were caused by 200 plus years of colonization. So you had generations of people growing up without political responsibility, and it's very difficult for people like that to create a democracy. You can create a voting system, but that's not a democracy. So does that get to your question? Yeah. So I think he in the early years. Yes, Maya.
There's a question here from Jill.
Oh.
Could you please comment on the difference between the power of vulnerability and not allowing yourself to be humiliated?
Good question. Jill, I hope you're doing pretty well out there. I know you've got a bug. Very good question. What is the difference between the power of vulnerability and not allowing yourself to be humiliated? Okay, well, there's an amazing story where a man wrote to Gandhi. This is back in the days when he was writing a newspaper called Young India, and I've recommended that we grab hold of something like this and read a week's worth or a month's work. And there's a quote in here I want to share with you soon. So he was like the Miss Abby or Ann Landers of nonviolence. People would be writing these cases into him. And this fellow wrote and said to him, "There is a bully in our village, and he slapped me in the face right in front of all of these people, and I felt humiliated, but I didn't slap him back. Aren't you proud of me?" And Gandhi said, "No." He said, "You should have hit him back because you felt humiliated. Your action was pure cowardice. But," he said, and this is Gandhi, But he said, why did you feel humiliated? If that person hit you, it's his problem. It's not your problem. So, if you can surrender something and take a risk without feeling humiliated, which is, after all, your personal choice, then it's the power of vulnerability and not humiliation. So it's a subtle distinction, and a lot of them will be very subtle, and that's why people will misjudge the significance of some of the things that Gandhi did. But the difficult case was in South Africa when all of this was still new, and he had worked so hard to get people to disobey the pass laws, burn their passes, and then he got them to go ahead and fill them out. And the first campaign, starting in July of 1907, was one of the most successful public campaigns ever mounted. They had like a 90% compliance rate where people refused to take out passes. So he had this tremendous success, but then he is able to go back and say, well, maybe this is not the right strategy anymore. Let's agree to take out these passes voluntarily, and then that it does not humiliate us. I might say that even dogs have a certain sense of humiliation. You have to be careful with them. Yeah.
It's so amazing. I feel like what you're really reinforcing as well is, again, that I feel like I see so much in activist discussions anyways, that this sense of grasping onto ideological dogma. And it's hard to, and what he's showing us this kind of flexibility, this ongoing flow of testing, moving, changing ideas, that is not afraid to go against what other people like of his party are thinking.
Yeah. No, at the very end of the 8-year satyagraha in South Africa, so we were in about through the end of 1913, Smuts offers him a concession. This is what politicians do. They still do this today. Problem, we'll study it. So he set up a commission. And occasionally commissions come up with recommendations that are followed. But this particular commission had no Indians on it. So you're going to discuss the problems of the Indians in South Africa without Indians. And he refused. And his best friends told him he was crazy. He had cultivated a friendship with the viceroy in India, back in India, and he said he urged Gandhi to accept this concession. This is the best you're going to get. His political guru, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, whom he absolutely adored, he takes him on a tour of South Africa in 2012, and they're just, I'll serve you. No, you serve me.
In 2012?
I said 1912, thank you. I do believe that Gandhi is still alive, but not quite in that sense. So, Gokhale is really his political guru, and even Gokhale writes to him, sends him a telegram from India, and says, this is the best you're going to get, don't be stubborn, grab it. And he knew that the position of influence and authority that they had reached was greater than that. And to accept that commission would be a step backwards. He said, we don't have to do this kind of thing anymore. And he held out against all his friends and his greatest political supporters. And that he was able to do that implies that he had a grasp on something else, which maybe is kind of hard for us to understand. But he will famously say at one point, if you see two statements of mine that are contradictory, go with the most recent one, because he was frequently contradicting himself in a way. For example, at one point in his ashram, he would not allow intercaste marriages. So, if a Brahmin wanted to marry a Vaishya, or worse yet, a Harijan, as he called them, he would not allow that marriage to take place in his ashram. Later on, he would only allow intercaste marriages to take place. And I can't interpret, what was his reasoning, why he did that. But the point is that again, he had such a deep grasp of fundamentals that he was able to be flexible to the point of apparent conquest of him by others on the surface. So wherever you see this inconsistency of his, you can know that you're not dealing with the absolute fundamentals. The fundamentals are that truth and reality are positive, and that human unity can never be violated. Okay. So are there other comments at this point? Because otherwise I'll... Yeah.
So, comment
Yeah.
from Kara.
Uh-huh.
Are the fundamentals the same today, to this day?
These fundamentals that I'm talking about are the same forever. Now, we're going to, next week when we talk about constructive program, we're going to have an exercise in getting at what are the principles underlying certain certain projects within constructive program, and what are the deepest principles underlying those principles. So we'll kind of have an exercise in getting at those, going deeper and deeper into the fundamental realities. But yeah, these fundamental realities are unchanging. Namely, that all life is one. And for example, I can never injure another person without injuring myself. That there are different kinds of injury, of course, and that every human being is looking for unity and looking for meaning and looking for respect. So that's why in his economic program, for example, he said, I do not want mass production, I want production by the masses. So you had maybe something like, he had millions of people out of work, and he needed to put them to work. Our situation is rather different. And, I'm not sure how different it is, actually. We have a lot of people who are out of work today. But the underlying principle is that they have to have an ability to make a meaningful contribution to life. Otherwise, they don't really come to life as a human being. How they make that contribution might differ. So let me say a word maybe about some of the principles that he discovered along the way. In 1926, he wrote a couple of books. One was his autobiography, or The Story of My Experiments with Truth, and the other was Satyagraha in South Africa. So one was the story of the man, the other was the story of the man's invention. In a way, today I'm talking about him as a fighter, and I'll be talking next week about him as a builder, and in a sense that should have come first. But since we think of him first as a fighter, I started this way. But it's really, when you read these two books, talking about his inner development as far as that goes, and talking about the development of satyagraha, it's very clear what he did in South Africa. He was thrust into this situation. He had no idea what was coming. He thought that he would be there for about a year. He ended up spending 21 years in South Africa. He thought that it was going to be a clerkship. He had this law degree and he was a fellow and all the rest of it, but he had so completely failed in Bombay as a lawyer that he had to accept this thing to kind of rescue his family. He didn't take Kasturba and I think by then 2 children with him. And suddenly he confronted evil in a way that threw him back on his deeper resources. And that sent him into a tremendously earnest quest for his role in life. What is his swadharma? And he'll make this little comment, here's the last sentence in Satyagraha in South Africa. He said, I left Africa after 21 years with a pang, because, among other things, it's in South Africa that I discovered my vocation in life. Can you imagine your vocation is to be an avatar and end colonialism and things like that? Well, c'est mon boulot, quoi. That was my job. As they say in Yiddish, you can make a living at anything. So, hard to know how to summarize these things, but in the very beginning in 1894 is when he realized, so this is the first year that he is, in 1893, he wouldn't get involved in the difficulties of the community because he was there to do a job for his employer, and he was absolutely responsible while he was working for Sheikh Abdullah. He was not going to get involved in anything else. The minute it was over, the first thing that he did was galvanize the Indian community to submit a petition to the Pretoria Parliament. South Africa was, what we call South Africa today, was divided into 4 different regions with different relationships to the crown and so forth. So the first phase in South Africa takes place in Pretoria. The second phase takes place in the Transvaal. And this was remarkable. It does not seem remarkable, but it was remarkable because this was the first time that the Indians, or possibly any colonized group, submitted a petition to the paramount power. It also represents something about what I call the escalation curve. Always start by assuming that your opponent may see reason and may give you what you want. Don't jump to some extreme case. Now, we're going to get back to fasting, by the way. Don't jump to some extreme case before you've given them a chance to respond to something milder. He gave him a chance. He was cheated. He was blindsided. He was basically ripped off. And he felt, okay, now the time has come to do something more definitive, to do some refusal. And as you know, on September 11th, 1906, they called a meeting. Several thousand people were there. It was mainly workers at that point. No, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. At that early stage, it was mainly what they call free Indians, like Indian shopkeepers who would come to South Africa to work there. And the Indian laborers were not represented very much. And he walks into the meeting and he says that, well, let me back up a second. He was about to go home when someone puts a newspaper in front of him that talks about the what they came to call the Black Act, the Asiatic Registration Act. He read this thing and he was horrified. And his farewell party turned into a political meeting. And he makes this arrangement with the community. I don't want you to support me directly, but I want you to send me enough business that I can survive here as a lawyer, and I will continue being your leader in this cause. So they readily agreed. They knew they couldn't do a thing without him. And so he got them together to make this petition and so forth. But he also, as early as 1894, he realized that the community is in bad shape and there's a great deal that they can do themselves without waiting for the regime to do it for them. So this is the beginning of constructive program. And I think it's incredible that it began in the very first year that he was active. So now fast forward a little to 1906, the law is about to be passed, and he feels that to comply with it would be to accept the utter humiliation of the Indian community and would be a way of saying that racism can prevail. So he sees things at that level and he says, this has got to be fought. In the end, if it can't be resisted, if it can't be overcome, I'm willing to give up my life. So you have that final sanction. Incidentally, before I get back to the meeting, let me just mention that a lot of people who criticize Gandhi say that why didn't he take up the cause of the indigenous Africans, the black Africans. They accuse him of racism. Well, this is ridiculous. His whole thing started out of sympathy for the Zulus. He formed this ambulance corps because he still felt that he was part of the empire and he couldn't, default on his obligations to the empire, but he also couldn't kill people. So he had worked out this compromise of being a medic. He did that 4 times. He was the only one, his ambulance corps was the only ones who would serve the wounded Zulus. The white medical people did not deign to touch them. They let them die of their wounds. They wouldn't give them antibiotics, pain relief, anything. So it was only Gandhi who went in and treated the Zulus. At one point when he was imprisoned, they put him in a cell with a Zulu, thinking that this would humiliate him and make him feel terrible and diminished. Of course, it had no such effect. At one point, the poor guy was bitten by a scorpion. And Gandhi always had this, he always said, I want to be a nurse, So he actually came and sucked out the venom from this person, and he said the look that he got from this man is something he never forgot. So,
And didn't he establish, wasn't there a resistance movement already among the black South Africans that had started back then, and that Gandhi even set up Tolstoy farm across from the kind of a community, a resistance community?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. There was a community of resistance, and our friend Gail Presby knows a lot more about it than we do. Yeah, I don't know much about it, but I don't think that they were very advanced in understanding how nonviolence works, and they were on the cusp of using violent resistance, but don't quote me on that one. But anyway, it's absurd to accuse Gandhi of racism, but there was a reason that he didn't get involved in the struggles of the Africans, the black Africans, and that is that they would not have understood what he was doing because they didn't have, you remember earlier I referred to that ideology that you gain power through sacrifice, giving up something. That was bred into Indians. It was part of their culture. They learned that at their mother's knee, even if they were illiterate. So he knew that he could build on the relatively advanced tradition of nonviolence within what is called the Sanatana Dharma, the eternal religion, as it was developed in India. And he could use that then as a demonstration for other people. But he couldn't go to those other people and give them 5,000 years of civilization and then launch them into satyagraha.
It's the idea of Swadeshi,
This is Swadeshi.
that you don't go into another community and say, I'm going to solve your problem for
Yeah.
you. It has to come from within the community.
Yeah. You solve your problem in your community, and then when it's settled, your sphere of influence grows. So you see that with him. He has this little sphere in South Africa. He comes back to the larger community of India. Even there, in 1915, he starts in Gujarat, his home state, in his home district of Champaran, Kedar, I think it was, and then gradually expands to the rest of India, building something which has repercussions in the wider world. And in 1934, he was visited by Harold Thurman, who was a well-known member of the Harlem Renaissance. He wrote a book called The Christ of the Dispossessed. I think he was very much drawn to Gandhi, came on a delegation to him with his wife. At the end of the meeting, his wife said, "You must come to America. We need you." And you can sort of understand why she would say that. And he said, "If I come to America, I will be a 9 days wonder in America. I mean, they'll consider me some kind of freak. I'll be a circus performer for them. So I'll lose everything that I'm building in India and I'll gain nothing in America. But, he said, if I can only accomplish what I'm after here, it will be an ocular demonstration that the right person in America can understand. And Martin Luther King was 6 years old, I think, at the time of that conversation. So that's exactly how it happened. So,
Is it Harold Thurman or Howard Thurman?
Howard Thurman, sorry. So,
We've got the book title here, Jesus and the Disinherited,
Mm.
Howard Thurman.
Mhm.
Is that right?
that's exactly right. I was exactly wrong. Yeah. Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. I don't know, but he may describe that incident in that book, I'm not sure. But just as he carried out, he employed Swadeshi in that case of not going to America, it was the same reasoning, and he said as much. It was the same reasoning in South Africa, where he could do this for people who understood enough of what he was doing that he could make it work. Then take that as a demonstration to other people and have them pick it up.
Yeah, I remember when I was first learning about Gandhi, I didn't understand even what khadi was and what he was wearing. I had no idea. It didn't make it just.
Yeah. My first exposure to Gandhi, I think, ever, was the cover of Life magazine, which was a picture of his cremation. And when I saw the wild grief that was going on the part of those people, I was completely repelled. And I thought, this is, later on, when I got political, but before I came to Berkeley, I came to understand that somehow he had carried off something tremendous, but I would never be able to do that. So there is a real learning curve that we have to build up. And I think this is part of what the Metta Center is trying to do. Help people assimilate what he was able to develop there. But he had to be allowed to develop it there. It's similar, if I may say so. I work a lot with Nonviolent Peace Force, which does unarmed civilian peacekeeping. And people say, but yeah, this is a late stage kind of intervention. And we say, look, unarmed civilian peacekeeping is not the whole peace movement. It's one function within a spectrum of things that you do that are appropriate at a certain point in the escalation of a conflict. So it's similar here. He deliberately chose something that he knew, even though it was tremendous, he knew there was a chance he could make it work. He did not, for example, march off to Germany in 1936 and talk to Hitler, but he did the best he could. He wrote him a letter, which is an amazing document, which the British never allowed to be mailed, since he was in prison at the time. So, I do know that we have a question about fasting coming up, and I'm going to get around to it. But here we are in the Empire Theater, and he goes in saying that we should take a pledge not to comply with this humiliating piece of legislation. And someone gets up and says, I swear as God is my witness, I'll kill the first man that offers my wife this insult. And I don't know if he said what he said in the movie, but it was just beautiful in the movie. I praise such courage. I need such courage because, my friends, this is a cause in which I too am prepared to die. But, my friends, there is no cause in which I am prepared to kill. So I don't think he actually said that. There's no record of it. But that was a beautiful piece of script writing, because that was Gandhi to a T. Suddenly, when this man says, I swear God is my witness, Gandhi says, oh my gosh, this is not a pledge. This is an oath before God. A pledge, something comes along and say, okay, that was then, this is now. Circumstances have changed, I've changed, can't quite follow up on this pledge. But an oath before God, you never go back on it. That was one of his most deeply held beliefs. practices. Fancy totally approves of what I'm saying now. You can hear her barking in the background. And he had to he faced a critical decision. He had to make a decision in a few minutes. Either to say, oh, no, we don't want an oath before God. We don't want to go that far. Let's just take a pledge, like I said before. Or is this people ready to take an oath that as God is their witness, they will never comply with this law? When I think of his courage, I think of scenes like this where he risked everything in this incredible moment. And another very instructive thing about it was he could probably easily have cajoled people into taking an oath. I've done this myself. I've been in rallies. I was in rallies in the free speech movement, and I was in rallies more recently where I said things that I knew would fire people up, not that they would think about it, but I succumbed to that temptation. And I have to say it basically got me nowhere. But at every single point, he was never losing sight of the future because of a present need. Is an important characteristic, the way he made decisions. Meaning, he would use this as an opportunity to educate the public, whether or not he would fail or succeed at his particular thing. And similarly, you may remember in 1931, when he goes to confront those people in Lancashire who hated him because they had put him out of work, he gives them a lecture on globalization, basically, and what colonization is doing. He said, you have 2,000 unemployed, I have 20 million unemployed, and we must fight together to overcome this system. Now, in that case, it worked beautifully right there in the moment. But every single point, he would not proceed until people understood what he was doing. So he said, look, this is the significance of what we're saying here. If you take this oath, even if everybody else goes back and you're the last person standing, you are not going to go back. That's what this oath means. It's true for me, and I'm ready to take the oath. But I want you to seriously think about this. And he gave him some minutes to think about it. He says, okay, everybody who's ready, stand up. And so here it is, 20 years later, he's writing about it in Satyagraha in South Africa. And he says, the scene is still as vivid in my mind as the very day that I was there. I see it to this day. Of those 5,000 people, to a man, every one of them stood up and said, we're ready. And that told him, Satyagraha is born. We are ready. And similarly, when he gets back to India, I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but I'm trying to, illustrate points so that we can use them to understand the story. In 1928, there was a land use issue in a region south of Gujarat called Bardoli, and he felt that the peasants were being, severely abused by the landowners and under the protection of the provincial government, ultimately under the protection of the viceroy, of the Raj, ultimately under the protection of His Majesty. And he knew that this could be overcome by nonviolent resistance. Let me just back up a little bit here. I hope this isn't too confusing. After he arrives back in India, he was told by Gokhale to keep his big ears open. I mentioned the big ears, right? Keep your big ears open and your big mouth shut for 1 year. You've been away from this country for 21 years. You do not know what's going on in India. And this is so true today. See the PLO trying to decide policy for the Palestinians who are on the ground in Palestine. They can't do it. So he did that. So he keeps his mouth shut for a year, and then he makes his debut, his re-entry into politics. And what happens? The Benares Hindu University is being founded, and Annie Besant, who is a great lover of India, this Irish woman who's part of the Theosophical Society, wants all these dignitaries to be at the opening ceremony. So she makes the humongous mistake of inviting Gandhi, and he shows up, in his khadi, And Indian princes are sitting there with so much jewelry on that, you can't even see them. And because British authorities are there with all of their medals and stuff. And he launches into a speech. I mean, I wish we had that speech recorded. He said, "You people are wearing more wealth than thousands of our starving countrymen. What's the matter with you? Give it all up." Besant was absolutely horrified. And she said, "Will you please stop it?" But he didn't. He rolled on, and finally just, stormed out of the place. So when Gandhi came back to India, I'm going to use a non-vegetarian expression here, he was loaded for bear. So if you look at that period from 1909 to 1915, he was very uncompromising. After that, he began to realize that he wasn't getting anywhere. But through compromising on the surface, he would be able to make progress. Okay. So, I was talking about Bardoli. He didn't go to Bardoli. He sent Sardar Patel, who was a lieutenant, so to speak, of his. And the campaign was launched. It was hugely successful. Peasants were beaten. The little that they had was taken away from them. Their precious livestock was confiscated, and they never offered a blow in return. And Patel comes back and reports all of this to Gandhi. At that point, he knows that the country is ready for a major satyagraha. It's only a question of figuring out where the leverage point is going to be. This is portrayed in a somewhat corny way by Attenborough, where he's sniffing the salt, on the seashore. Ah, salt. And the next thing you know, the viceroy is saying, "Salt?" It didn't quite happen that way, but in some way, he figured out that the British would not be able to appreciate the compelling value of something like salt in India, because they didn't come from the tropics, and because they had all the salt they wanted. For them, you could have 100 African slaves beaten to death in the Bermudas to produce 1 pound of sugar. They did not do what we do today when we go into Whole Foods or Oliver's. We look at the label and say, where does this come from? What went into it? So they didn't understand. And that's his calculation was exactly correct. The viceroy actually said, "I am not losing any sleep over the salt campaign." And the next thing you know, he lost the whole empire over it. So that brilliant campaign was preceded by this test in Bardoli. Similarly, the signing of the oath in the Empire Theater was preceded by a period of reflection and testing. And when they all stood up to the oath, then he knew that the people, in general, had the capacity for satyagraha. I have to warn you that some of this interpretation I'm doing on my own. He doesn't necessarily say, "Aha, I now knew that the people were ready," but I think you can read this between the lines. So as as we were saying before, if you don't believe me, I have to be Gandhian enough to say, that's okay, come up with some other model, see if it works, let me know about it. So what he did basically in South Africa was he developed himself spiritually by very, very serious, open-minded testing. A lot of Christians came to him and they really wanted him to convert to Christianity. Later on, E. Stanley Jones would say, there's only one real Christian in the world today, and he's a Hindu. So they understood that Gandhi was a tremendously spiritual person, and they thought, therefore, he should be a Christian. And he went to their churches and he listened to their sermons. And he weighed quite openly, and he felt, no, I don't think that these people got it. And I don't think what they understand is significant enough for me to abandon my religion, which would be the worst violation of Swadeshi. So even though he hadn't quite worked out the Swadeshi yet, he had an instinct for it. And later on, even E.F. Schumacher will come to him and say, I want to be a Hindu. And he would say, no, 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 no. You go back and be a good Christian. Don't ever abandon that. So he roused the community. He arranged for the first, he took the opportunity to carry out the first test of satyagraha and found that it was ready to roll. And he developed his own spiritual orientation. So he knew where he was going to get spiritual nourishment from. It was from the Bhagavad Gita and the Vedanta and from his own experiences. And armed with those three things, he was able to launch satyagraha, which went on for 8 years and succeeded. Knowing that, he was ready to go back to England. Sorry. A lot of British people may have made that mistake, actually. He was ready to go back to India and really carry out the struggle where it needed to be. Okay, so look, I have been carrying the whole conversation. I knew this would happen, get me talking about Gandhi, but really I would love to hear from you and other comments that may be online.
Just a reminder about the fast.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let me talk about that. Frequently, people reach out for fasting because it's so spectacular and because they may be dimly aware of the incredible things that he did with it. He goes into Calcutta. I talked about what's called the miracle fast in 1932. Later on, after partition, he'll go into Calcutta and do nothing but stop eating. And within about 6 days, he has ended a riot. So this is another thing we have to try to understand, is his incredible power over millions of people. I know my own teacher, Sri Ishran, who was not political, he told us one time that when Gandhi was fasting, he couldn't eat. It's not that Gandhi said, don't anybody eat, I want everybody to fast along with me. He said the opposite. He told Nehru not to do it. But, Ishran would sit down and say, I can't eat. The guy, he's not eating, I can't eat. So he had kind of developed mirror neurons to an incredible degree. And fasting, thank you. So he carried out these incredible fasts, and we imitate them without realizing that that's not going to work. And in the course of developing this model, he developed 5 rules, which I kind of pulled out of one thing and another, and then I discovered he actually did list them at one time. So in order to do, now when I say fasting here, we're talking about a fast unto death, an open-ended fast. We're not talking about, I'm going to do a cleanse. Cesar Chavez often fasted for self-purification without any attempt to influence other people. That's a whole different animal. That's between you and your guru, or if you have one, or what you think you need to do. But I'm talking about using a fast unto death as a means of political persuasion. Okay? And when it works best, it is a form of persuasion. When it backfires, when it doesn't work well, it's a form of coercion. So, rule number 1 is you have to be the right person to do this. Remember, he tells Nehru, you go and be the jewel of India, leave this kind of thing for me. Because he knew perfectly well that Nehru was not the kind of spiritual animal that Gandhi was. Vinoba was a different story. Abdul Ghaffar Khan was a different story. But Nehru was political and social. So he told him not to do it. Basically what this means is you have to have gone so deep in your own consciousness that you have so much control over your will to live that you can actually put that on the line. And that is more than most of us can reach. I know I have a colleague of mine, her husband was in Vietnam. He was exposed to Agent Orange. He got a brain tumor. He was dying. He told his wife and daughter, unplug me from these machines, I'm ready to go. They pulled out all these tubes, and he went into a coma, and about an hour later he suddenly regained consciousness and said, plug me in, I don't want to die. So we would have to be able to say, I have been down to the basement of my consciousness, and I'm ready and willing to renounce my will to live, because I don't want to live in this environment. So it would be a rare person who would really be capable of doing that. Secondly, it has to be the right audience. And Gandhi said it has to be done against a lover. Someone has to care enough about you that there'll be enough resonance there that they will respond. Otherwise, you're just starving yourself to death. Thirdly, and these are in no particular order, thirdly, it has to be the last resort. You have to start with petitions, go to satyagraha, and when all of that has failed, and the issue is that serious, then you have to be ready to risk your life, and that may take the form of a fast unto death. It has to be the last resort. The demand that you make has to be doable, as you can't ask people to do things that are hopelessly unrealistic. Like he never went on a fast saying, I'm going to fast until you leave India. In fact, he never really fasted against the British. He fasted to arouse his own people. And fifthly, and finally, it has to be consistent with your whole campaign, and in fact, with your whole life. So if you look, for example, at the Irish hunger strike, I think you will see that it fails on all 5 counts. It was, they went around doing horrible things to people, but when they were put in prison, they went on a hunger strike. So it was not consistent. It was not the last resort, because they hadn't really tried to dialogue with anybody. They reached out for violence right away. It was not the right audience, because Margaret Thatcher said, let them die, and they did. And they were not the right people for the job, and I think I'm forgetting. See, consistent, last resort, correct audience, correct person.
Demand.
The doable demand, that's right. Yeah, maybe they were okay on that one. I don't exactly remember what they were demanding.
The first time I realized, really the depth of the fast is this. He did fast unto death. That was.
Yeah.
Wasn't just any kind of fast.
Yeah. He did penitential fasts, and he did other kinds of fasts to awaken people. For example, one of his first campaigns after 3, brilliant successes in 1917. I always kind of compared 1917 to Gandhi. For Gandhi, it was like 1912 for Einstein. Einstein wrote 3 papers in 1912, any one of which would have been absolutely groundbreaking for science. And as someone has suggested, to write 3 such papers in 1 year is suggestive of divine intervention. So in 1917, Gandhi did this. Oh, incidentally, if you read the very beginning, the preface of Satyagraha in South Africa, he'll explain how he stepwise introduced Satyagraha when he got back in India. He was asked to come to Ahmedabad, a big city where his ashram at the time was on the outskirts of, to assist the mill workers who were striking for higher pay and so forth. And he did organize a strike, and it was working well, but some of the strikers went back to work and kind of scabbed, and even worse than that, some of them actually took up violence. And he felt in order to rescue the strikers and get them back on track, he had to fast against them. It was not a fast unto death. I don't think it was unlimited, but it was serious. It was taking no food, nothing but water. And it worked on them. But unfortunately, the mill owners were so impressed that they acceded to the demands of the strikers. And you would think, oh, well, he must have been very pleased. Actually, he was not. He was bummed because he felt they did not do that out of persuasion, they did it out of coercion. And of his 12 major fasts, he felt that 3 or 4 of them had failed. So he failed 1/4 of the time. You know, what does that say to us? That he felt that they did it because of public opinion, they did it because he was making them look bad, not because they had gained sympathy for the cause of the mill workers. That was his analysis anyway. So, yeah, he would only go to that final resort in cases where he was literally unwilling to go on living if the demand was not met and he had no other resource, like he was in prison. The reason it's such a drastic thing is that at a very, very deep human level, you are saying, I am no longer part of your community. I am no longer part of your world. I don't want to live in your world if you're going to go on with this. So it's not something to be taken lightly. Yeah, question.
So there are 2 questions here.
Good.
Does fasting raise your spiritual consciousness? And the other one, was Gandhi using, or is it only to be used politically? Being fasting?
Yeah, I think fasting can raise your spiritual consciousness if you use it in the correct way. Like, I mean, I've never done it for that reason, right? But if you say, suppose you have a hunger pang and your mind and body are saying, grab some food, and you say, that is not me, my better judgment is closer to who I really am, I'm doing this for a reason, I can endure this discomfort for a higher purpose, I could imagine that it would help. But in my tradition, we don't do that. We skip 1 meal a week, just, you know, for some reason, but we don't use it for that reason. So I can't really comment on that. I can imagine where it would have that purpose if you had the right attitude. Now, as to the other question, which was...
Is it used only politically?
Oh, is it used only politically? No, I would say even in these cases where Gandhi used it to change a political structure, he got the Harijans to form an agreement with him that the British Raj would respect such that they did not have a separate electorate, or not exactly that. Or he stopped the rioting in Calcutta. And a couple of other occasions where really big things like that happened. I would say that at the very deepest level, he was awakening people to their sense of unity with him. And I'm going to say that that's not a political fact. That is a spiritual change which has a political expression. Yeah.
Just about 10 minutes
Ah.
left, but I guess I just want to help you segue. I think it's really, what's really come home for me in this course today is that it's really missing, looking at Gandhi only from the perspective of resistance alone, or satyagraha alone.
Mm-hmm.
Paints a very weak picture of who he was and the options that and even how to understand nonviolence.
Yeah.
So next week you're going to be talking about constructive
Yeah.
Do you want to give us a short preview of what to expect?
Yes, I'll be suggesting some things to read in our Google Doc, and going back to that big discovery in 1894 when he realizes the community uplifting itself is prior to making demands of the oppressing community. And talk about the way that this gradually became his main, let's say his main thrust. He actually writes a letter to Jamnalal Bajaj saying, my real politics is constructive work. And he came to believe that if you did constructive program correctly, you would never need satyagraha, that you could change everything through constructive work. But the reality of the grimy everyday life that we're embroiled in is that there are times when you need resistance. You need satyagraha. You need what Martin Luther King said, non-cooperating with evil as well as cooperating with good. But it should be done as a double negative, that I'm not against you, I'm against your negativity. I am still trying to waken you up. So we will do that, and we'll look at where it comes from in terms of his deep belief in satya and truth, and we'll look at the 18 projects that he came up with, and I'll put a document to that effect on our Google Doc, and we'll have the enjoyable exercise of looking at each one and saying, what's the equivalent today? Do we have some stuff that he didn't put on there? Did he have some stuff that we don't need? Which of these do we need to adapt? Which can we take as they are and which are superfluous for us, and see if we can come up with a constructive program of our own, which is something I've been thinking about, for a long time. Okay, yeah, I've got about 108 different ideas crowding into my mind, but I don't want to throw too much stuff at you. Yeah. So just one final comment then. Gandhi was, of course, he did appear inconsistent many times because of what we've been saying all along, that clinging to very deep principles allowed him to adjust changing things in accordance with situations as they changed. It allowed him to compromise on things that were inessential. But he said, all of my activities have one cause, and they are all rooted in my insatiable love of mankind. So I would leave you with that thought, that you take this claim of his and see if you can figure out how everything that he does is rooted in his insatiable love of mankind. At least after 1915, when he lays it out to the princes at the Benares Hindu University. Even there, it's kind of raw, but it is coming from that one source. At least let's test that claim. See if you can figure out a way that everything he does really arises from that love. Okay. Well, thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk, mostly off the cuff, about my favorite subject. I did want to just share with you, I've been reading Young India day by day, and this was the part that I read last night happened to be the most famous conversation in this whole conversation. It's where he is asked about, oh dear, it's going to be hard to read this. Well, I can't, I can't quite read this print. It's very small. Let's see if that works. Is a magnifier, Maya? Okay.
Uh-oh, your microphone.
Oops. I disconnected myself.
No, you're good.
Okay. Oh, this is perfect, Maya. You and I are one. Mr. Gandhi, Sri Sotalved, in his examination of Mr. Gandhi, this is at a kind of a pre-trial hearing, asks if it did not require high intellectual and moral equipment to arrive at truth. And the question is, different individuals would have different views as to truth. Would that not lead to confusion? He says, I do not think so. Okay, I need to go back. The first question was, however honestly a man may strive in his search for truth. And incidentally, even a woman could potentially strive in her search for truth. The notions of truth may be different from the notions of others. Who then is to determine the truth? Gandhi's famous answer was, the individual himself or herself would determine that. So then the obvious question was, different individuals would have different views of the truth. Would that not lose to confusion? And he said, I do not think so. As provided the individual were honest, that this is an honest inquiry, and provided that no one would resort to violence, it absolutely didn't matter how wacko your belief system is, you would find your way to the truth if you were carrying it out honestly. Okay, so that is a famous, whoops, now I've lost my place. This is a famous, I would say of all of the conversations in young India, that was probably the most famous one and maybe the most instructive one. Yeah?
And doesn't say, won't that lead to chaos? He says, that's why you have to use nonviolence.
Right. He said, if no one will take to violence, if you don't take to violence in this, what you believe in any case is never going to be the absolute truth. We're not given that as human beings. Even Goethe in Faust says that if God were to appear before him, having truth in one hand and the striving after truth in the other, I have to take the striving. Because absolute truth is only for God. So we're always going to be imperfect at some level. Therefore, it's incumbent on us not to be violent towards anyone. And as long as we have those two things, not using violence and being willing to renounce something if it turns out to be wrong, in the Einsteinian mode, then we'll gradually get to the truth, which is our truth. Anyway, and more than that we can't do as a human being in one incarnation. All right, very good, everyone. Again.
Yeah, so two things.
Ah.
Was Gandhi born with this insatiable love for mankind?
I would say, I'm going to make a strange comment here, but it's after 1 o'clock, so I think I'm allowed now. I would say that all of us are born with an insatiable love of mankind. But we're also born with some things that have come up, some conditioning that's gotten in the way. And when we're finished watching the mass media, that conditioning gets even thicker. So in his case, the only difference is he was born with very, very light conditioning that was able to float away. And then he realized his oneness with everyone. Partly because his mother was a saintly person, must have been incredibly loving. But, who knows why certain people are born with certain capacities and others not. But I think we can state that at the core of our being is that same love.